So anyways, that's enough of that. So now we're going to go to should we trust the empty tomb? And of course, this normally would be our communion Sabbath, but because we had the agape feast on Good Friday, we are not doing communion again. Sorry, Rhea. Rhea thought we were having communion. And she was excited and looking forward to it. But I had to inform my wife that no, we are not, because we did it last week. So, but the empty tomb, we just celebrated, as most of the world calls it, Easter, or the resurrection weekend. We have just celebrated that, and the tomb was empty. And should we trust the empty tomb is what we need to talk about. Yeah, we should. We should. There's definitely evidence why we need to trust the empty tomb, and it's amazing, and it's a blessing. It's part of God's plan of salvation. And the resurrection of Jesus, it's the foundation of our faith, right? It's our hope. Without the resurrection, we have no hope, because without the resurrection, the plan's not complete. That was part of the plan. So, Jesus told them, tear down this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it. Well, everybody thought he was talking about the building. You're not even going to build this building in 3 days. Doesn't matter how many Amish people we got. It's not being done in 3 days. But he raised his temple in 3 days, and that was an amazing thing, and that's part of the plan. So, and that gives us our hope. We can have victory. Without it, there is no victory. There's no hope. And Paul tells us this in 1 Corinthians. It says, if Christ is not risen, your faith is futile, and you are still in your sins. All right? But this world is full of skepticism. And there's people who are always trying to play on things and trying to cause doubt and find any tiny reason to say, see, no, this didn't happen. This isn't true. But we can trust the empty tomb. And we must trust the empty tomb. So is the resurrection a historical reality, or is it simply just a legend? Did Jesus rise from the dead? Or is it just a religious tradition? Many have sought to explain away the empty tomb with alternative theories. But today we're going to examine some reasons why we must believe in the empty tomb. So the empty tomb was guarded and it was secure, right? In Matthew 28, 11, 15, it tells us the stories. The tomb was sealed with wax. So right underneath this white line, I don't know if you can see, it looks kind of like a shadow. That is a rope. And that rope would have went over that tomb. They put that on there. They sealed this tomb. They typically didn't seal a tomb. This tomb was sealed on orders, right? That rope would have been there. They would have used either wax or clay to make the seal, but probably wax, beeswax. You heat it up and soften it. It's very pliable. So you can make a seal and push it on there and seal it. You would take the signet ring and stamp it in there, and now there's proof who sealed it. But with having the signet ring in there, you can't redo the seal. So if you open the tomb and then you put it back, you can't redo the seal because you don't have the signet ring. You're not going to be able to pry it off and save it. It's going to get destroyed. The wax is going to embed into the pores of the rock. So you're going to have to scrape it off. I mean, it would be a mess. It would not work. So the tomb was sealed with wax. But the Jewish leaders feared that the followers might steal his body. Okay? So in Matthew 27, 62 to 66, we're not going to read all through these scriptures now because we're going to be too pressed on time if we do. But that tells us that they were worried about them stealing the body. So Pilate had even said, tell them, he paid them to tell people that Jesus that they had stolen Jesus' body. So they had that plan from the beginning to make it look like the body was stolen. So, one of the earliest arguments was then that the body was stolen. John 20, verse 19 tells us where the disciples were, right? The disciples were hiding. So if they were hiding, do you think they had the courage to go out and steal the body? They were hiding because they were fearing for their life, okay? They're not going to go steal the body because they're hiding. They're afraid. The Roman guards were trained professionals. If they failed to guard this tomb, they knew that their lives were at risk. Their lives were at stake. If Jesus' body had been stolen that night, the Jewish leaders and the Roman leaders would have been able to find it. There would have been people to witness it. They would have seen it. There was no earthly power. There was no Roman or Jewish leader that could stop God's plan. The tomb was not empty because of deception, but it was because of divine power. Now, some people would say it's the wrong tomb. Well, the tombs were sprinkled along, so that's quite possible that that could happen. But in Mark 15, 43 to 46, it tells us that the tomb was Joseph of Arimathea's. Okay, so he was a respected Jewish leader, but also had a good amount of money. Everybody would have known where his tomb was. It wouldn't have been a secret. People, it's just part of their tradition. They knew whose tomb was whose. So they would have known the location. And the other thing is, the women who went there in the morning had just been there the night before. So they would have seen and realized, oh, we're at the wrong one. There's also would have been evidence when you have an open tomb, because that rope would have been on the ground somewhere. You would have been able to see where the wax was on the rock and where it was on the stone. So it doesn't make sense that they say it was the wrong tomb. That doesn't hold water either. Plus, there are so many leaders there that knew what tomb it was going to be in. Somebody would have pointed to them and said, hey, look, you're at the wrong tomb. You need to be over there. You're half a block down. The resurrection wasn't a mistake, and it wasn't a misunderstanding. Jesus showed himself alive to many eyewitnesses, proving he had risen. John 19, 31 to 37 says that Jesus' side was pierced with a spear and blood and water flowed. Now that's a medical sign of death. They knew he was dead, which leads to the next theory, which is the swoon theory, where they say Jesus never died. They say, oh, some people say he just lost consciousness. He didn't really die. Now we think about that. Think about the beating he took, which just about killed him, right? So he was physically beaten, tortured, spit on. People were punching him in the face, doing all of this. That stuff's all going to take energy. And then he carried a cross. They say weighed between 200 and 300 pounds. And that's going to burn up energy. And then he hung on the cross until he died or until he passed out. But then after they took him to the tomb, they wrapped him in the cloth. But they wrapped him with 100 pounds of spices, or almost 100 pounds of spices. So if you're almost dead anyways, you're unconscious to where you can't breathe or can barely breathe, then nobody can tell you're alive, which first of all, when they shoved that spear into him, if he was still alive, pretty sure he would have at least flinched or moved somehow. The body would have done something. He would have felt that. But then they wrapped him. So if you're barely breathing anyways, and they wrap you in cloth and they've put all this weight on you, you're probably going to do you in anyways. But now you get to that point, and if he's in the tomb, And he's so beaten and battered that he appears to be dead. Well, one, that means that takes away his divinity and places him completely in humanity, which means he has no strength. And now he's going to roll a 2,000-pound rock that you can't even get to. That rock, you saw, was a big round disc. They would have had a track carved out in front of the tomb that rock could roll in, and it keeps it spaced, and it can roll. But that tomb's sealed off from the inside. So from the inside, you can't get to that rock. There's no handle. There's no remote. You're not going to move that from the inside, and he doesn't have the strength anyways. If he is that beaten, if he is, so close to death that you can't tell you think he's just passed out, he's not going to have the strength to physically do that. Jesus truly did die. His resurrection wasn't survival. It was divine power. Eyewitness confirmed 1 Corinthians 15, 3 through 8. Jesus appeared to Peter, to the 12, and more than 500 people at one time. Okay? There's a reason to believe the empty tomb. There's too many witnesses. It was a public event. Okay? I mean, this is a public event. It doesn't even have 500 people at it. There was over 500 people who saw Jesus alive. So it was a very public event. Some people would say, oh, well, maybe they had hallucinations. Well, hallucinations are personal. You're not going to have the same hallucination as Jane. Jane's not going to have the same hallucination as Lynette. They're all going to be different, okay? But can you imagine 500 people hallucinating at once? First of all, I can't imagine 500 people hallucinating at once. But then to do it and have the same hallucination, it's not going to happen, okay? It wasn't a hallucination. Hallucinations are personal, and they're not shared by groups. Jesus appeared to multiple people at once, and he physically interacted with people. He ate food with them. He allowed them to touch him. Luke chapter 24:11 and John 20:24-29. The disciples were initially skeptical. They weren't expecting a resurrection, so their belief wasn't based on wishful thinking. The resurrection was a real event. It was witnessed by real people and experienced in a physical way. The disciples, what were they expecting from Jesus? A kingdom on earth, right? They were expecting him to be a king. They weren't expecting the resurrection. They weren't expecting him to come alive in 3 days. He had told them that, but that's not what they understood. They were Judas, when he sold him out, was expecting that he would overthrow them at that point. That's what Judas thought. That didn't happen. Why would they plan to steal the body if they didn't think he was going to come to life in 3 days? There would be no point to that. It just doesn't make sense that they would do that, because that's not what they were expecting him. It would have no purpose in the story. The resurrection is the foundation of our hope, but the resurrection was preached within just days of the death. In Acts, they are already preaching the resurrection. It was just a couple weeks afterwards. So that means this story wasn't a myth, right? Because they wouldn't have come up with that story that quick. You don't build a myth in a couple of weeks. It takes a long time. The early church also, they suffered and died. How did Peter die? Upside down on the cross. Right. Why did he die upside down on the cross? Because he didn't want to die like Jesus did, right? But why did they put Peter on the cross? Because of his beliefs. Bingo, that's it right there. They put Peter on the cross because of his beliefs. If Peter was going to the cross because of his beliefs, and he believed that they had thrown Jesus' body in the dumpster at Quick Trip, is he going to go to the cross and die for that? Are you going to die for your lie? No. I'm not going to try and prove that lie that hard. I'm going to stop at some point. Okay? I'm going to let you die for my lie. Right? So if that comes to that, then that might be okay. But I'm not going to do it myself. I'm not going to go through that myself, and neither did they. You know, they stood by their beliefs. They stood by what was true. Peter died on that cross upside down because of his faith in Christ, because of his belief in what he knew. And the rest of the disciples they were all tormented as they were killed. So wasn't a good thing. But they all stood by their faith. None of them said, oh, wait, it was all a joke. None of this is true. So the resurrection is central to God's plan of salvation. Okay? It guarantees that Jesus will return and that believers will rise again. The resurrection isn't just an ancient belief. It's a guarantee of our future. If we trust in Christ, we can have confidence in eternal life. So why do we trust the empty tomb? Why does it still matter? It proves that Jesus is the Son of God in Romans 1-4. It confirms that sin and death have been defeated. It guarantees our resurrection at the second coming. And it gives us hope that Jesus is intersecting for us now. You know, we just celebrated this weekend the resurrection and the empty tomb. And that's the foundation of our faith, the empty tomb. We can believe in the empty tomb. Don't let people tell you otherwise. It's the resurrection that matters. But then we talked about this. I'm kind of. This isn't part of my sermon, but this was some part of what I'm going to talk a little bit about. What we talked about at the Agape Feast, or what I closed with, because there was Katie had asked me a question about something I said. So I'm going to, for those of you who weren't here, I'm going to bring you up to date on what I said and what happened, and then I'll try to explain it to you. So we had our Agape Feast, which is always an amazing. You guys do a very good job with that, so thank you for that. That's always a blessing, and I know everybody really likes it. But at the end, I was talking about the close, and the resurrection is great. The death on the cross, the resurrection. Without it, there's no hope, like I said. We need to believe in the empty tomb. We need to believe in the resurrection. But we're already believers, right? We already believe. How does it affect a non-believer? How does a resurrection affect a non-believer? Does it affect a non-believer? It doesn't, because they don't believe anyways. So then I think, how can we make it affect for them? How can we make a difference through it? But for me, with the resurrection, you also have the time on the cross and the time in the tomb. That's all part of it. But another part of this story was what happened on Thursday in the upper room. And that's where the question came that Katie had. Because I talked about the upper room, and we all know the story. They came in, they rented this room, they have this hall all set up. There we go. This is what we know as the Last Supper, right? This is what we have in our minds as the Last Supper. So they came in, and they're going to have the Last Supper. Everybody sees the water and the towels to wash the feet. Very customary that you would wash your feet in this time. It was part of their tradition. It was also kind of a necessity, because Well, they live in a desert area, and they always walked around in sandals and flip-flops, right? So their feet were always really dirty. Now, everybody here would have bathed this week. This was actually 2 religious holidays that fell this year together. So it was a very major week for them. So they're all clean. But when they walk in, their feet are filthy, so they still need to clean them off. All the disciples see the stuff sitting there to wash the feet. But who washes the feet? The servant, right? You would have a servant do it. If the host didn't have a servant, then his children would wash the guest's feet. And if he didn't have children, then he would end up washing them. But somebody would wash the guest's feet. But there's nobody there to serve these people. So Jesus gets up, girds himself, goes over, and he starts to wash their feet. Whose feet did Jesus wash first? Judas. Okay? So he starts with Judas's feet. And that was her question. Her question was, how do we know that Jesus washed Judas' feet first? If it doesn't say that in the Bible. Okay? So we'll keep going with the story. So he washes Judas's feet, he washes the disciples' feet, and he goes on. And part of my conversation and my thinking was, after Judas sold him out, what did he tell before? Peter would deny him how many times? 3 times. Boy, that's support from your good friend, isn't it? One of his best friends, and that's the support he got. But as Jesus went through everything he went through on Friday, as he's being beaten and tortured, who was there for him? There was a few there. Mary Magdalene, his mother Mary, right? The disciples, all but one gone. They've bailed. Probably in the background, so Jesus can see him. Jesus can see him denying him and hiding. Jesus can see them acting like they're ashamed to be apart. How would that make you feel when this is what your friends are doing? When they nailed him to the cross, they were all there, right? Fighting for him. They were all saying, praying for him. We're praying for you. No, they weren't there. When they pick that cross up, think about this. He's nailed to the cross. They pick it up. They don't put that cross in that hole nice. They drop it. To be quite honest, these guys were callous. They probably dropped it with force. And it would have been some serious pain. But were they there? No, they weren't. When he died on the cross and they took the spear and shoved it in his side, were they there? They weren't. When they buried him, when they took him down and they took him to the tomb and they buried him and they started to anoint him, were they there? No. But his mom was, and Mary was. Oh, when he rose on Sunday, when they go to find the tomb, they weren't even there then when they found the tomb empty. They weren't with. But whose feet did Jesus wash? The disciples. Those who bailed on him. Those who weren't there. If we want to make a difference in this world, if we want the resurrection to make a difference in this world, we are called by God to be like Jesus. Right? We are called to do what he did. And what did he do? He served. Who did he serve first? Would you call Judas his enemy? I would. He served first the one who betrayed him. And that is her question, because she's trying to figure that out. And I put this picture up because it's wrong. It's really wrong. And it's incredibly wrong. This would have been the table they were at. This stuff here in the middle would not have been there. This table was a horseshoe. A servant would come in and feed or replace food from the middle of the table so everyone could have access to food. This table would have been 6 to 10 inches off the floor. Mind you, from my pinky, the tip of my pinky to the tip of my thumb, I used to be a roofer, I know this, is 9 inches. Okay? So somewhere about that height was the height of the table. Okay? Customarily, you see some people sitting up here. Customarily, the Jewish people would sit up when they ate their meals. On the Passover, it was required this position. You would lay and lean on your left arm while you ate, and then you could pick the food off the table. Because these tables were used for wealthy people, not for poor people. So this is the way they were required to eat on the Passover when you had a banquet celebration. So even though it shows these some people sitting up, they wouldn't have been. They would have all been like this person, laying on their left. So what happens is, anybody know what happens when you lay too long on your arm? It falls asleep. So you know what you do? You roll back to your left, and you would lay on the person's chest next to you. Okay? So it's very personal. It's a very intimate situation. Ooh. Sorry, I didn't want to go there. There we go. So in Luke, I do believe it's Luke 22, 24 to 30. It tells us that Peter sees the one who laid his head upon Jesus' chest. And he's talking about John. Okay, so John was sitting next to Peter. The Bible also tells us that Jesus gave the sop to the one who was going to betray him, which means Judas was sitting next to Jesus. Okay, so here's the way it goes. When you're in here, the second position right here goes to the host, the person who was hosting the party. This position right here goes to the guest who is second, which was John. This position here, the third one, goes to the person, the guest of honor. Earlier, they had been discussing who would be to the right hand of Jesus. Who would be his right hand? Judas wanted to be the guest of honor. Jesus is the host. John laid his head on his chest. He shared with this person, the guest of honor, which was Judas. Peter was last. Coincidentally, this would be the first person, second, the third would be here, fourth, and so on, all the way down the line. The least, remember the story when Jesus says at the wedding, you sit in the position of the least of them, so that if the guest, or if the host says, you are in the wrong place, I want you to sit up closer, maybe you get the third or the fourth seat, you would have to get up from the lowest position and walk to this one to take this position, and everybody would see that you went from the lowest, that you were moved up. Don't presume that you get that spot, because if you're supposed to be here, you are going to have to get up and walk in shame to the end. Okay? That's just a side story, but it all fits with this table. So there's a hierarchy through the whole table. So we know that during the Last Supper, the Bible tells us that Jesus got up during the meal and walked over to the basin, grabbed the towel, and put it on. Custom was, when they sup, custom was that it would be handed to the guest of honor. Okay? It was the guest of honor who received that sop from Jesus. The sop, if you don't know, if I didn't say, is usually bread dipped in possibly olive oil with seasonings or some other type of a sauce, or it could have been meat, either one. In my mind, it's always bread because I don't eat meat, but just a sidebar, could have been meat. So anyways, the host would share that with the guest of honor. Who did Jesus share it with? The Bible tells us he shared it with Judas. The Bible tells us that Judas was there. The host would also, anything he served, he would do for the guest of honor first. So tradition was when Jesus got up, girded himself, grabbed the water, he would have went back and done the guest of honor first. That's how we know Jesus washed Judas' feet first. His enemy, the one he knew was going to betray him. Think about that. We walk around as Christians and we get in our little cliques and our little groups. And sometimes we think we're all high and mighty because we're Christian. Because we don't drink, or we don't smoke, or we don't do that, or we don't act like that. We are called to act like Jesus. Please tell me, who did he serve first? His enemy. Are you ready to serve your enemy first? Are you ready to serve your enemy first? That's how this weekend makes a difference for a non-believer. We serve our enemy first. But that is also how I know that Jesus served Judas first. All right. So, and I wish Katie was here. and the internet's not, the system's not working right. So this isn't going out on Facebook. So Katie can't even be at home watching it. So I don't know if she listened. I hope that answered her question. Or if anyone else had any questions on it, I hope that answered your question. But either way, there's a plan of salvation. And we're getting out of here. And as we talked earlier, it's our choice. Our closing hymn today is Because He Lives. It is hymn number 526. When you find it in your hymnal, please stand and join us. Otherwise,